Hi everyone! Guess what I've been thinking about today? Dominoes! Because, as you know, with dominoes, if you affect one thing, everything else falls apart. Just like life. You've been learning about all the properties of life. What is life? How does it reproduce? How does it evolve? DNA, all that kind of cool stuff. But none of this is important without context, because organisms are not isolated beings. We interact with each other and we interact with our non-living environment. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn about these interactions, a field called ecology, an absolutely awesome field. And you're going to learn not only about how organisms interact, but what kinds of processes sustain populations. And that will lead us to the remainder of this unit, and that is conservation biology and how we conserve not only organisms and their populations, but the processes that sustain them. So let's get started learning about ecology. So again, what was that word? It was ecology. Ecology is the study of how species interact with each other, i.e. their living, their biotic environment, and their non-living environment, or their abiotic environment. And so this is the way the world works. Organisms interact. They are always doing things. We have organisms competing with each other for resources, predator-prey relationships, mutualisms, all sorts of interactions, and of course how they interact with the non-living things around them, the air and the water and the soil, rocks, etc., etc. For example, here is a beautiful of ecology in action, and that is a coral reef. And you see living creatures, these fishies and the corals and the algae and everything living on these rocks. So these organisms are interacting with each other, and they're interacting with their non-living environment, the water and the rocks and other things that are non-living that are important to their survival. So let's dive into ecology, a little bit of ecology, just an overview, and figure out what it's all about. So by overview, we mean that we're just going to scratch the surface of the different kinds of topics within the amazing field of ecology. And of course, ecology is a sub-discipline of biology. And you could get whole PhDs in ecology. You could get whole PhDs on little aspects of ecology. So we're just going to gloss through it. But if you're interested in this topic, I urge you to go on and take specialty classes within the realm of ecology. So again, ecology is the study of interactions. It's the study of how organisms interact with their living, i.e. their biotic, and their non-living, their abiotic environment. Now, why ecology? Why do we have ecologists, the guys that study ecology? Well, ecologists are interested in understanding the natural world. We want to know how things work, how organisms are able to do what they do, and for what purpose they're doing those things. But real ecologists are interested in the why questions. Why are they doing what they're doing? What evolutionary pressures were on them to evolve certain adaptations and certain ways of interacting? So for example, these cute cuddly birdies here, notice that they're interacting with each other. That would be part of the biotic community. And they're interacting with their non-living environment, the air, for example. But they also have special adaptations for dealing with their environment. So for example, the green backs that help them to camouflage among the leaves that they're in. So anyway, an ecologist would find this scene absolutely fascinating to figure out. So why do we have ecologists out there? Why study ecology? Well, for one thing, it's just absolutely cool, and who doesn't want to know as much about life as possible, and including how organisms interact with each other. But more importantly, we're in a crisis situation right now. We're losing species faster than they can be discovered. We have changing storm patterns going on. We've got crazy fires, forest fires at alarming rates that we haven't seen in the past. We're losing organisms such as amphibian populations are crashing worldwide, and we really don't know why. We're losing our fish populations due to not only overharvesting, but things like climate change and pollutants. We're losing our natural songbird populations. So anyway, things are happening fast, and we can't even figure out why everything's happening the way it is, but certainly a lot of it has to do with human activities. So there could be anywhere from 5 to 100 million species out there in the world still yet to be discovered. At this point, we've only cataloged about 1.8 million species, just a fraction of what could be out there. But again, we're losing these species faster than they can even be discovered. And so that is sad. And so we're kind of in this race to understand the world's biodiversity. What is biodiversity? It's all the organisms that are out there, all the life, and not only just all the life that's out there, but all the processes that sustain this life. And really that's what ecologists are interested in, are these processes that sustain life. So that's why we have ecologists. And it's cool. And you might remember a little bit from our unit on evolution that the more genetic diversity in a population, in general, the better, because genetic diversity and, in fact, biodiversity is nature's insurance policy against disasters. So we already learned that if you have a lot of inbreeding, if there's not a lot of genetic diversity in an area, then if the environment changes, like a disease comes in or climate change, there's not a lot of differences in genotypes for anyone to be well adapted to that situation. But when you have a lot of genetic diversity, there's a better chance that someone's going to have the winning genotype. And so the more biodiversity in an area, the more genetic diversity, and the better you are likely to survive a changed environment. And we're seeing crazy stuff happening. You know, if you look at just the landscape, you can see how much habitat destruction's been done. Like, for example, you see all these farms that are there, deforestation. We're losing beautiful, beautiful populations like these redwood trees right here. We don't even understand whole groups of organisms, like this mycelium from fungi that lives underground. We barely know anything about fungi. We're just starting to learn about these guys, especially with regards to the genetics. And we're starting to see disruptions to some of the fundamental processes that keep life on Earth going, the biogeochemical cycles, and we'll be learning about these in this unit. So things like the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle and the phosphorus cycle and the water cycle. Many things are affecting these cycles that are so important for life on Earth, and most of these disruptions are in some way related to human activities. So we're seeing the climate changing. Now you might say, well, the climate's always changed, and in fact that's true, but we're seeing it now happening at an alarming rate, and all arrows are pointing to a role of human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels, in contributing to this climate change. So all you have to do is pick up a newspaper. There's always studies coming out revealing some other aspect of climate change. So for example, this headline, ice loss opens the Northwest Passage. Ice withdrawal shatters records. And these are just examples. Keep watching the paper. The evidence for the problems due to climate change are staggering right now, especially in places like Antarctica and the North Pole. We'll get into that subject in a little bit. But all of this points to the need to understand how populations grow and decline. What are the factors that lead to this? And one species in particular, we definitely want to keep a close eye on the population growth, and that is, of course, the human population. So anybody know how many billions of people are living on the Earth right now? Well, of course, it's going to depend when you're watching this slide because this number changes so fast. And in fact, at the time of this recording, it's 2014, and there are 7.2 billion people on planet Earth right now. And that's a net amount. So that's births minus deaths. Now you might say, okay, and so, well, just to give you a little bit of a perspective on that, when I started teaching this topic about 13 years ago, there were 6.4 billion people on this Earth. And when I was born, there was about 4-point-something billion people on this Earth, and I'm not that old. Okay, I'm old. Well, I'm not that old. I'm in my 30s. So that puts it in some perspective. So anyway, all this points to the fact that the human population is experiencing what we call exponential growth. That is growth that starts out slowly and seems like it's not going anywhere, and suddenly, boom, it skyrockets into a J-shaped curve. So we have over here time, and over here we have billions of people. And so you can see, if we look at the earliest records of Homo sapiens, us, somewhere between 2 and 5 million years ago. So this was in this area, the hunter-gatherer period. And you can see that the population was nowhere near even 1 billion people. It started to slowly increase during the agricultural revolution, still hadn't reached 1 billion, and then it had a crash at the time of the Black Plague. A lot of people died during that thing. And so it's back down to nowhere near 1 billion people. But then the Industrial Revolution hit, and once the Industrial Revolution hit, all of a sudden, people started living longer. There was technology, there was medicine. People were able to get resources that they couldn't get before. And so you had not so much an increase in births, but an increase in lack of deaths. Infants were more likely to survive, and people lived longer. And so this contributed to exponential population growth. And to put this in perspective, in 1804, we reached our first 1 billion people. 1804. We're now in the 21st century. Again, at the time of this recording, it's 2014. So you're talking about just a little over, or really right around 200 years, you go from 1 billion to over 7 billion. So it took millions of years to reach that first billion, and less than 200 years to go from 1 billion to 7 billion. Think about that for a minute. You're like, okay, yeah, and, well, what does that mean? In order to sustain a population, you have to have resources. You have to have the limited resources that organisms depend on to survive. So while the human population has been exponentially growing, the resource base to support that population has not. And in fact, it's been declining exponentially due to overconsumption. And so at some point, there won't be the adequate resources to sustain an exponentially growing population. Or will there be? That is the question. Because at some point, if the human population follows what's happened with every other population that's had this kind of exponential growth, at some point we hit a cap. That cap is the point at which some individuals can't get the resources they need. Do we already see that? Well, the argument could be at least in some places. And so where are we going to reach that cap? Will it be a little over 7 billion? Will it be at 10 billion, 14 billion? Never? Well, never defies logic, right? Eventually, there won't be enough resources available to sustain the entire population. And some people might argue, well, we have the technology to invent the resources. Well, it takes resources to invent technology, right? Things aren't made out of a dream of genie. And so where are those resources going to come from? So to put this in perspective, let's take a look at a population clock. These are a lot of fun. You can go on Google and just type in World Population Clock. I put a link to one of these here for you. So let's go ahead and click on this, and here's one example of a population clock. And you'll see again today is it's June in 2014, and if you look at this world population, at the moment it's 7.24 billion people worldwide. Now look how fast this changes. Woohoo! Again, this is a net number, and I think what's very interesting, this is the number of people that were born today. About 372,000 something, and the number of people who died today, 154,000 people. You can see that the total population growth today is births minus deaths, and you can get this on a year. So very interesting to just see how fast this changes. And we have to ask, is this sustainable? You can get the population by country here, and you can scroll down. Here's your exponential growth graph like we talked about before. This gives you puts things in perspective. So the first billion was 1804, second billion 1927, and then 1960 they were at 3 billion, 14 years later they were at 4 billion, etc. So you can see how fast this thing is happening. And you can even look up the year you were born and see how many people were there. So yes, I'm old. I was born in 1977. So somewhere between 4 and 4.5 billion people, and here we are in 2014, and we're at 7.2 billion. Pretty crazy, if you ask me. And at 1900, we were at 1.6 billion. So crazy stuff, isn't it? Okay, So moving on, we're going to touch a little bit about all the main components of this world of ecology. So an ecologist could study any one of these levels or multiple levels, which is the case for most of them. And this is called the ecological hierarchy or the ecology hierarchy. And so depending on what kind of questions you're asking about the world, you might be interested in focusing on the organism level or the individual level, and this is where you're just studying the organisms themselves. So you're looking at their tactics for reproduction, for survival, things like that, but most of the time you're not going to be satisfied with just that level. True ecology really starts at the population level. So population ecology is where you're studying how groups of individuals, all of the same species, are interacting with each other and with their non-living environment. So, and you might remember from our evolutionary studies, the population is the unit of evolution. Evolution acts on populations. That's where you see the effects of evolutionary change, not at the individual level. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time in this segment talking about population ecology and some of the questions that population ecologists would ask. But another fascinating field of ecology is called community ecology, and that's where you're studying communities. And communities are groups of different species interacting with each other and with their non-living environment. So they're the interactions of populations of different species. And you can take those communities and see how they interact with each other, and that puts you at the ecosystem level. So the ecosystem level, you're taking all these communities and you're also looking at the abiotic factors, things like the air and the weather, the water patterns, the soil, minerals, all these kinds of things, pollution, and how those non-living factors affect living organisms, communities of living organisms. You also at this level are very interested in those nutrient cycles I mentioned, the biogeochemical cycles and how those affect organisms. And finally, when you put it all together, the crux of the hierarchy is what's called the biosphere level. And a biosphere is anywhere that life occurs. So it occurs, of course, on land, and we know it occurs in the water, but it also occurs, for example, in the soil. You have insects and parasites and bacteria living in the soil. It also occurs in the air. Birds, fungal spores, bees, etc., all live in the air. So the biosphere is anywhere where life occurs. And if you're interested in studying this level, you're usually interested in global processes and how they affect organisms. So for example, someone studying climate change would be at the biosphere level of ecology. Okay, so that's the ecological hierarchy, but again, we're going to start at the population level. So we're going to look at the field of population ecology. Now, lots of different awesome questions that could be asked in the field of population ecology. One of the things population ecologists are interested in is the spatial structure of populations. In other words, we're interested in knowing where organisms within a population and among populations put themselves. So we might be interested in looking at a species' range. Where is it found? Its geographic distribution. We might be interested in how organisms within a population arrange themselves with respect to each other and with respect to resources. And are there microhabitats within a range? So are individuals found in particular areas within their whole range? We are interested in asking questions about population density. That means the number of individuals packed into a particular population in a certain area, and how their populations grow and decline. That's called population dynamics, and we're going to spend some time on that. Population ecologists are also interested in the patterns of movement of individuals. In other words, do they stay in one place? Do they move from place to place? Do they make huge migrations, like in the case of whales or salmon? So these are also very interesting questions in the field of population ecology. Now, personally, I love it all, but I absolutely love this one, and I'm biased because it's my field. I love it. Interested in studying the genetic structure of populations. In other words, we talked about inbreeding before, right? Like when we were talking about assortative mating, and you remember that too much inbreeding tends to be very detrimental to a population, very bad. Well, if you're interested in studying the genetic structure of populations, you're interested in how much genetic variation is within the populations and how much genetic variation is between populations and what are the factors that affect that, because that has very important implications for the ability of the population to evolve in a changing environment, especially in the face of things like climate change and disease and introduced exotic species. But it also is interesting to look at the landscape and say, okay, what abiotic features, the rocks and the minerals and the resources, how has that affected the genetic structure of a population? So for example, if you have salmon, for example, and part of a population has migrated into a small stream that's surrounded by cliffs and rocks, it may be slightly geographically isolated from the rest of the population and therefore inbreeds and maintains its own genetic structure different from the rest of the population. Very interesting to study, and of course that's the raw material for evolution to happen. How cool is that? I just love this stuff. It's so cool. So again, just to recap, what is a population? A population is a group of individuals of a single species living in a single area. And a population ecologist, or the field of population ecology, is where you study the structure of those populations and how those populations interact with each other and with their environment, their non-living and living environment. So again, just to talk about some of these different things that a population ecologist might study, if they're interested in studying a species' geographic distribution or range, or that of a population, your geographic distribution or a species' range is the area where it occurs. So for example, we got two species here, the loblolly pine and the sugar maple, two species of trees, and you can look at this map and just see, okay, in general, you'd say the loblolly pine's range or geographic distribution is in the southeast United States. And they're giving you two different graphs here, two different maps to show two different scenarios depending on climate change. And in the case of the sugar maple, you'd say, its range is not in the southeast, its range in general is in the northeast. And of course, its range can change in the face of a changed environment like climate change. Down here, you say, okay, this species is present everywhere where we see red here. And, you know, this might represent another population or another species. So this would be the geographic distribution. Now, in order for an organism to exist in a certain range, it goes to show you have to have the correct habitat, the suitable habitat to support the individuals of that species. And what makes a suitable habitat is having not only suitable climate, etc., but suitable resources, sufficient resources. Now, obviously, resources can include things like food and water. We all know that. But sometimes suitable resources may be things you may not think about. Like, for example, it could include mates, because you don't need a mate to survive. Or maybe you do. No, not really, right? No individual really requires a mate to survive. But if you're going to look at successive generations and the ability of that population to exist through time, you must have suitable mates, because otherwise you die out in the first generation, right? So a lot of times, in addition to mates, you have to have shelter. Yeah, I'd say this is probably true of humans, right? To survive for long periods of time, we need some sort of shelter. But here's one you might not think about. Some species require, as a limited required resource, sites for suitable courtship display. So this is especially true in some birds and insects and things like that. So as an example, in Illinois, which let's see if we can find Illinois right here. There he is. So in central Illinois, there's a native bird called the greater prairie chicken, and it's actually an endangered species, or at least a threatened species. And one of the reasons that's led to its decline is habitat destruction, because these guys, in order to find a mate and actually mate, they need sites for courtship. So the males find these little dirt mounds, and they get up on these dirt mounds and they do their dance and puff up their feathers and do what they do. The females go wild for it. They love it. But they won't do that courtship display unless they have a dirt mound to do it upon. Well, due to habitat destruction and the introduction of ring-necked pheasants by hunters, Those ring-necked pheasants are very aggressive, and they also like those mounds, and so they'll take over the mounds, and the greater prairie chicken males can't get to them. Therefore, they can't display for their females, and therefore their females don't recognize them as the same species, and they don't mate. And this is leading to a drastic decline in the greater prairie chicken populations. So all sorts of things can be suitable limited resources. And this just goes to show you really need to understand the ecology and the biology of organisms to conserve the biodiversity, because there may be required resources you didn't even think about. And of course, hiding places can constitute limited required resources, especially if you have predators that are always after you. If you can't find those hiding places, you can't escape predation and you become lunch. And of course, having throwing off that predator-prey interactions can throw off a whole ecosystem. If the prey can't find the hiding places, the predators eat them and they get lots more food than they normally would. So their populations initially go up, but then they run out of prey because they ate them all, and boom, they crash. And we'll talk more about that later when we talk about community ecology, etc. So lots of things can constitute limited resources. Now, if you're a population ecologist, you may be very interested in the movement of individuals. And so two words here to try to distinguish: dispersal and dispersion. Dispersal, dispersion. Dispersal is the movement of individuals from the place they were born to somewhere else, right? Many of us have dispersed. So, for example, I was born in Colorado and now I'm living in Hawaii. So dispersal can happen all sorts of ways. Now, the reasons for the dispersal are very interesting to study. So sometimes this may be due to species introductions, which could be accidental or deliberate. So we just talked about the ring-necked pheasant being deliberately introduced by hunters. But often, in the case of something like zebra mussels, the introduction was accidental. The zebra mussels attached to boats and got carried into the Great Lakes and into all the different creeks and rivers in the area of the eastern United States, and they're causing all sorts of problems. So they were dispersed, but due to introduction. Sometimes individuals leave an area because they don't have sufficient resources. So in the case of humans, you might say, well, maybe you get a job in a different state, and so you move away from where you're born or from your parents. That's dispersal. But in the case of other organisms, maybe there's not clean or adequate water or food or mates, etc. And so they may migrate away. Emigrate would be leaving an area, immigration coming in to find these suitable resources. But sometimes, and I think this is very interesting, organisms disperse to avoid inbreeding. And you see this especially in plants. For example, this thistle right here, these little seeds are produced from the parent plant, and the wind carries them away so that they can fertilize somewhere else away from their parent. And this keeps them from fertilizing with their parent. So it's a way of avoiding inbreeding. But you also see this in the animal world. So, for example, cute, cuddly golden lion tamarins, little orange monkeys, are awesome. They live in family groups, but when the males get to be a certain age, the parents kick the male out of the house, and he must gain acceptance into some other group. Actually, kind of sounds like humans in a way, doesn't it? So, anyway, so dispersal is very common. Dispersion is something different. That's the study of the movement of individuals within a population. And this is fascinating. How do individuals space themselves out from each other? So we can study these patterns of dispersion by just going out in the field and taking measurements and figuring out how individuals are placed. So, for example, you could imagine individuals of a particular species or within a particular population may be randomly dispersed. They're just found haphazardly wherever they're found. Turns out this is actually rare. Most organisms have a set pattern of dispersion with respect to each other. But if it's random, that means that the distribution does not depend on the presence of others. That individuals don't care if their neighbor's right next to them or 5 feet away. It's just that's the way it is. This is usually used as a comparison point to measure deviations from randomness, so you can figure out if there's a pattern to how individuals are spacing themselves. For example, one scenario would be that individuals are in a clumped dispersion pattern. So in other words, they are all the individuals of a population are found in these clusters, And usually you find suitable resources where these clusters are and maybe not suitable resources in the spaces between. So they're found in discrete groups. And this is, it could be due to the presence of resources. In the case of animals, it's often due to some kind of social predisposition. In other words, they're located in close family groups or small, in the case of humans, maybe this would be a village, for example. But it's often due to resources. Maybe this happens to be where water is or where a particular food source is. So you can imagine like flocks of birds, and they're in little clumps because that's where clumps of worms are after a rain, something like that. And also sometimes you see it because individuals are close to where their parents were. So for example, in oak stands, acorns may fall right under the tree, and therefore you get a whole stand of oaks, and then a space and another stand of oaks, etc. But another scenario, which is even, to me, more interesting, is uniform dispersion. And this looks something like that. This would be where individuals are more or less evenly spaced, equally spaced from each other. And this is so cool. Like, what causes something like that to happen, and what kinds of organisms experience that dispersion pattern? This is also called hyperdispersion, and it's often due to social interactions. So individuals trying to keep other individuals away from their home or their resources that they've acquired. Let's look at a clump dispersion pattern. So you see birds clumping into flocks or fish clumping into groups to find safety in numbers, right? They're actually all competing for the center space. Nobody wants to be on the outside because that's where the predators are going to bite first. Or salamanders, like you see here, might clump under a dead log, and so therefore they have discrete groups because they're all clumped under that resource. Or trees may see their seeds found in that particular area of the parents, as we mentioned. But the uniform dispersion patterns are fascinating. So take these guys, for example. These are Cape gannets. They're seabirds, and each guy, well, each girl, builds a little nest here, and it turns out they are almost exactly equidistant from each other. And in fact, they basically space themselves by, they sit on their nest and they reach their necks out, and wherever their head falls, that's the distance to where the next individual can build their nest. How cool is that? So they're kind of guarding their nest from, and their resources from the other individuals by doing that. And you also see this in plants. So this little beauty right there is my favorite plant. This is the creosote bush. The creosote bush is found in the lower Colorado desert, and it's just so beautiful. Can't you tell? Turns out this guy exhibits pretty much a uniform dispersion pattern, but I have to digress and tell you how cool these plants are. Turns out the oldest living organism on Earth is a creosote bush. It's about 12,000 years old. It's found in the desert of Southern California. And these guys, there's a reason why they're the oldest organisms, because they are so well adapted to their environment. These guys, they have these huge taproots that can go down 30 feet into the desert soil and to get whatever little bit of water is there. And then their leaves are these little tiny waxy things, and that's an adaptation to conserve water. So they undergo very little photosynthesis, but prevent that water loss because water is such a limited resource in the desert. Even cooler, if you go into the lower desert after a rain and you smell the air, you will find that it smells very medicinal, and that's from these creosote bushes. Because if you take the leaves of these guys and you rub them between your fingers and smell, it'll smell very medicinal. And that's because of the compound creosol that is in the leaves. And creosol is actually being studied by humans as an anti-cancer drug. But for these guys, they have creosol as a way of fighting off their competitors, specifically other creosote bushes and herbivores and other plants. And so they put that creosol not only into their leaves, but also out into the soil. And that is chemical warfare. It keeps the other plants from growing within their area and using up their water and soil nutrients, because these are very limited resources. They got to keep all they can to themselves. So because that creosol is in the soil, it keeps the other plants from growing within the vicinity. And that gives this guy a uniform dispersion pattern. How cool is that? So cool. And how would you study these things? Well, there are techniques to do it in the field, and if you take an ecology class, you'll probably get to perform one of these. But basically, you go out and take measurements, comparing individuals to each other, and you plug it into a math formula. Because, guys, I got news for you. Ecology is all about math. Lots and lots and lots of math. Fortunately, I'm not going to make you do much math in this course, but if you take ecology, be prepared for the math, because when ecologists go out to study and try to find the truth about the interactions of organisms, they base it on mathematical theories. So the idea is that math can make predictions of nature. Very philosophical, isn't it? There are different ways to figure out the number of individuals in an area, the population density. The simplest one is you look at a local population, a small population in a particular area, and just try to count all the individuals in that population. In most cases, that's not feasible, right? There's just too many individuals to count, and they move all over the place. But if you did want to figure out what the population density is, either by directly counting or estimating, you're dealing with a variable that is very important in the field of ecology, and we call this variable capital N. So capital N in ecology stands for population density, the number of individuals in a particular area. So don't forget N, because we use it all the time in ecology. Now, a population ecologist is very interested in figuring out what causes N to change, what causes populations to change in the number of individuals. In other words, what causes populations to increase or decrease or stay the same. So again, the classical ways you could go out and just try to count all the individuals in a population might work for maybe a number of harlequin bugs on a particular bush, but in general, it's especially when you get into larger areas, that becomes unfeasible, and you therefore need to estimate the population density. And there's different ways to do this. So one way you could estimate a population density is go out and take a sample, or maybe 3 samples that you average, take samples of the number of individuals and count the number in the sample, figure out the area that you're talking about, and using that, extrapolate out to the number of individuals in the whole area based on the samples. So that's a very, very common way, and is good if the individuals in your population are stationary. In other words, they're not leaving and coming in and dying and being born, etc. But if you have a more realistic population where individuals are moving in and out all the time, in other words, they're not stationary, then you need another technique. And there's different techniques in the field of ecology. One fun technique is called mark recapture. And this is a lot of fun. A very common school-based lab you could do on mark recapture is to go out and capture pill bugs, roly-polies, right? Like this guy. And what you would do is you're basically looking at changes in population estimates through time. And so you'd go out for a first sampling session and you'd catch as many pill bugs as you can, and you'd take, say, whiteout, and you put a dot on each of the individuals that you catch, and you record how many you caught and marked, and then you release them back into the habitat. And then you come back sometime in the future, maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, depending on the organism you're dealing with, and you capture pill bugs again. But this time you look and see if any of the pill bugs you captured were the ones from the previous capturing time, because they had the white dot on them. And if any were recaptures, you write that down, and then you also look and see how many new ones you caught, ones that did not have the mark. And you mark those guys with a different color, say pink whiteout. And you record that, release them, come back a third time. Figure out how many white ones, how many pink ones, and how many new ones you have. Mark the new ones with a different color like green, release them all, etc. And you keep doing this. And there's, of course, a mathematical formula that you're plugging information into. And based on that, you'll be able to estimate how many immigrants and emigrants you have, and therefore estimate the total population size of your organism, in this case, pill bugs. So that's a common technique as well, and is a lot of. Okay, now the last part of population ecology we're going to study is what's called population dynamics. And this is a fascinating field, very mathematical in nature. And in fact, the principles of population dynamics did not come from ecology. They came from the field of economics, where people were looking at interest rates, growth of interest rates versus declines, et cetera, et cetera. But those same principles could be applied to organisms, and that's why ecologists kind of adopted those same principles to study population growth and decline in humans and other organisms. So here you see a cartoon of the same exponential growth graph I showed you before for human populations. And here the train is saying, I think I can, I think I can, I really hope I can, man, I hope I can, in terms of world food delivery system. So that's kind of an interesting cartoon, but just illustrating the point, how high can we go? Okay, so at the core of studying population dynamics is a variable that we're going to call little r. Little r stands for intrinsic growth rate, or intrinsic rate of growth, also called your per capita growth rate. And this is the rate at which a population will grow if the resources are not limiting. In other words, assuming everybody gets the resources they need, what is your biological potential for growth? In other words, if you're a cockroach, you have a very high R. In other words, you can put out hundreds of babies all at once, right? So you have a very high natural tendency to increase your population size. Something like an elephant has a very low R, because they only have a baby at a time, and they stay pregnant for 11 months, etc. So they're not putting out lots of babies at once, and therefore they have a low intrinsic growth rate, a low R. Now, all R is those individuals coming into the population minus those individuals leaving the population. And so you can say, okay, who's coming into the population? Well, the new babies that are born and the immigrants that are coming in. So if you add the birth rate and the immigration rate, that will give you this part of R. And if you take those coming in minus those going out, that will give you your net intrinsic growth rate. Well, those going out are those that die, so the death rate, plus those that leave, which is the emigration rate. So B plus I minus D plus E equals R. So your intrinsic growth rate, your biological potential to increase your population, is the product of individuals coming in minus those leaving. You could say births minus deaths, or births plus immigrants minus deaths plus immigrants. So if you plug in some numbers here, you'll see that if those coming in is greater than those coming out, that makes, R greater than 0, and that means your population size is increasing. Makes sense, right? Think about it for a minute. Now, if those coming in is less than those going out, that means your death rate and your immigration rate are higher than your birth rate and your immigration rate. Your R value will be less than 0. It'll be negative, in which case your population is decreasing. Now, what about if this part of the equation is equal to that part of the equation? Then this minus that is 0. So if R equals to 0, then your population is stable. It's neither increasing nor decreasing. It is staying the same, and we call that zero population growth. Whew. Okay, now don't let the word equations scare you from this stuff. It's intuitively logical. Just think about it. Your natural tendency to increase your population size on a per capita basis, just based on your contribution to it, is going to be those coming in minus those going out. And if those coming in is greater than those going out, your population increases. If those going out is greater than those coming in, it decreases. And if they're equal, your population is neither growing nor decreasing. It's stabilizing. It's zero growth. Okay, now, what happens if you're interested in looking at how that R value changes through time? In other words, how do births and immigrations and deaths and emigrations, how do those numbers change, and how does that change affect the rate at which you're adding individuals to the population? In that case, we say that we're studying the population change, how the population's size is changing over time. And so we use this is actually a Greek letter called delta. I called it D here for simplicity, but I could have put a triangle here as well. So the change in population size, the change in density, over the change in time is going to be how these two things are changing through time. So that change is going to depend on this balance of births and immigrants and deaths and immigrants. Okay, so in other words, again, ecologists like math. And so they actually use an equation, and I'm not going to expect you to learn this equation or be able to do any math with it, but FYI, what we're talking about here is a mathematical equation where your change in your population size over time is equal to your intrinsic growth value times your current population size. So don't worry about this, just understand that it's very interesting to see how populations change through time. So if this is your population size and this is time, you can see that in a case of exponential growth, the growth starts out slowly and then suddenly skyrockets. And so again, R here is your intrinsic rate of growth or increase, which is on a per capita basis, each individual's contribution to the next generation. And anyway, so that would be an example of exponential growth. So all of this is derived from calculus. Don't worry about it unless you're interested in it, but just understand that exponential growth is based on this formula, and that what you're looking at is how your population is changing through time when resources are unlimited. So that's the key to exponential growth, the idea that your resources will keep going forever, and therefore everybody gets what they need, and there's nobody that's going to die because they didn't get the resources, and thus your population can keep growing exponentially. So really what this is if you're looking at how your population is changing over time when growing exponentially, what you're really looking at, what this equation is telling you, is the slope of this line, rise over run. But again, don't worry about the math unless you really want to worry about the math. I do want you to understand the biological principles, the ecological principles behind these things. Exponential growth, no cap to the resources, everybody gets what they need, versus reality, which is where usually populations don't grow exponentially for very long. The reason is eventually, as your population increases, the density increases in an area, they start using up the resources, and eventually some individuals do not get the resources they need to survive. They die, and your population begins to come down. The growth rate slows until it stabilizes at zero growth or declines, and that decline can happen slowly or fast, and we'll talk about those scenarios in a second. So we say that exponential growth, where there's no cap to resources, is density independent growth. In other words, you can keep growing your population independent of what the density was before. So it doesn't matter how many individuals are already there, you can keep growing. It's density independent. Logistic growth is density dependent growth. In other words, how fast and how much you can grow is dependent on the density of individuals that are already there, because there's so many individuals there that as you add more, less and less resources are available, and eventually there's a cap to how big that population density can get. So we say that the population growth rate in a logistic population growth scenario, that this growth rate decreases as your population size increases. That's what we mean by density dependent. So, and please feel free to pause this and rewind it at any time. This is some pretty heavy stuff here, but just take your time, keep listening to it. This is what we call a logistic growth curve. So whereas the exponential growth curve was J-shaped, logistic growth curve is S-shaped. So it starts off, again, here's our N, our population size, our population density, and on the x-axis is time. And you can see it starts off looking a lot like an exponential growth curve. It starts off slowly, and then boom, suddenly the population skyrockets. So it starts growing exponentially. But because this is density dependent, logistic growth, you can see that as you keep growing, where's my cursor? There he is. As you start growing, you start feeling the squeeze. You start feeling the effects of having other individuals already there. And thus, individuals are using up more and more resources as this population increases, and eventually you hit an asymptote. And we call that asymptote K. And in this case, K stands for carrying capacity. Carrying capacity. Why does carrying capacity start with a K instead of a C? It's a Latin thing. I wouldn't understand. But anyway, K means carrying capacity. And your carrying capacity, which I'll highlight this in a minute, carrying capacity is the maximum size you can have your population at given the current resources. If you go anywhere, if your population goes just above that carrying capacity, then some individuals don't get the resources they need and they die or fail to reproduce and the population comes down. If you're below that carrying capacity, there's still a surplus of resources, even though it might be slowing down, and thus you can add more individuals to the population because everybody's getting what they needed. Exactly at K, at carrying capacity, this is your zero growth line here, because at zero growth, there's exactly enough resources for all individuals to get what they need. So you're neither increasing nor decreasing. So let's add some little things to here. See if I can get my little cursor here. So if I'm just going to put a point here. Let's say I am above carrying capacity here. Well, at this point, there are not enough resources to sustain everybody. So let's draw my line here. If I carried it up to here, now I'm above the maximum number of individuals that can be supported given the resources. So my population will come down. It'll either level out at carrying capacity or it could go all the way to n equals 0, in which case that would be called extinction. Okay, so that's one scenario. Another scenario here, let me see if so another scenario is if I was under here, let's say my dot was right here. Oh, that color change didn't work. It's still blue, but that's okay. If I was down here, well, because I'm below carrying capacity, that means there's more than enough resources to go around, and thus I can continue to grow until I hit carrying capacity. And again, right at carrying capacity, so if my population is here, or in this case right here, then my growth is 0. So I could actually say my growth, the rate of change, dn over dt, if you can read this, equals 0. So I'm at 0 population growth because my population is neither increasing nor decreasing. It's stable. So the growth rate, the number of individuals you add per unit time, is unchanging. It's 0. So up here, above K, I'm going to have negative population growth because there's not enough resources to go around, so the population will decrease. Below K, I have positive population growth because there's more than enough resources to go around. Whew, have a headache yet? It's really actually kind of fun. And here's a little brainstormer here. Where on this graph, on this line of population growth, would my growth rate, dn over dt, be the greatest? In other words, where I'm adding the most number of individuals in the shortest period of time. Dun, dun, dun. There goes the Jeopardy questions. Let me try to change. Dun, dun, dun. Turns out it's going to be right in the middle here. So here would be, at this point, I'm going to say dn over dt is at its max. Just write max here. And the reason being, so this is, if you've taken math, you know this is the inflection point. This is where you go from a bowl like this to a bowl like that. That point where they meet is called the inflection point. And the reason why is this is where your slope is the least, because I'm adding the most number of individuals in the shortest interval of time. And so that is where my growth rate is the most rapid. And of course, up here, it's slowing down. You're really running out of resources. Here, it's growing very fast because you have lots of resources. Interesting stuff, isn't it? Okay. If that didn't give you a headache, nothing will. Okay. So let's go on and talk a little bit more about carrying capacity. So again, carrying capacity K is the maximum number of individuals, the maximum population size or the maximum population density of a certain species, a certain organism that a habitat can support given the resources through time. And I mentioned that if you overshoot your carrying capacity, your population can either nicely go back to its carrying capacity and bob along, or it could crash. And so 2 examples of this, these are Tasmanian sheep, and they were introduced into Tasmania, they were introduced into Tasmania, experienced exponential growth, but eventually as their population increased, they kept adding more babies, more individuals, they overshot their carrying capacity. So it ended up being that there weren't enough resources to support the whole population. Some individuals died, but they hadn't overshot it so much that tons of individuals didn't have resources. Just a few of them didn't get the resources they needed. And so the population declined, and then they were below carrying capacity. There was a surplus, so they had a boom, a baby boom, and they went over a little bit, and then they went under. And so you can see that the population size just bobbed along its natural carrying capacity, which in this case was about 1.5 million sheep. And all this happened very quickly. We're talking in the matter of about they were introduced about 1800, so about 125 years. That's kind of what you hope would happen with populations, but unfortunately it doesn't always happen that way. So here's the case of the Alaskan reindeer. They were introduced into Alaska in the early 1900s, 1910, and by 1950 they had gone extinct. And if you follow their population increase, you'll see they started growing exponentially very quickly. And at some point, they overshot their carrying capacity so much, so quickly, that a lot of individuals didn't get the resources they needed. They died off, and so many had been affected that, boom, the population crashed to extinction, crashed to zero. Now we can ask ourselves, as for humans, are we Tasmanian sheep or Alaskan reindeer? Time will tell. Anyway, this idea of carrying capacity really is the central concept in the field of ecology, because everything you study in ecology about organisms, their interactions, their population dynamics, it's all dependent on how organisms acquire resources. And so if you run out of resources, it affects your population size and therefore affects individuals that interact with your population. Central concept of ecology, carrying capacity. Now, based on this idea of intrinsic growth rate and carrying capacity, you can kind of group organisms into 2 categories, the R strategists and the K strategists. So these are evolutionary reproductive strategies. So if you think of things like cockroaches that we mentioned before, they produce lots of babies all at once, but they have very little parental care, right? They lay their eggs, the parents are on their merry way to infest another day. The babies pretty much raise themselves. So our strategists tend to be very small organisms with lots of offspring, little or no parental care. They don't really protect the offspring. They tend to reproduce really early, and they don't live very long. Most die before they reach adulthood. And anyway, they tend to also be generalists, like they can fulfill many niches. A niche is, kind of an ecological space in not just physical space, but time space as well. So things like dandelions would be our strategists, cockroaches would be our strategists, most insects actually would be our strategists. Not all, though. There are some insects that do have parental care. A K strategist would be something like an elephant. They tend to have lots of parental care, have very few babies all at once, but put lots of parental care into those babies. They tend to be rather large organisms and often are specialists. And so, saguaro-cacti would be an example of this. Elephants would be an example of this. Humans would be an example of this. So R strategists versus K strategists. And so this rhinoceros here, which is a K strategist, that reproduces late, lives long, lots of parental care, very few individual babies. This guy would follow what's called a type 1 survivorship curve. So if you, this is the percentage of surviving offspring, and this is age. And so you can see that lots of survivorship of the babies early on, and then they die late in life. So it makes a curve shaped like this. So these guys live to be old and have high survivorship as babies. Type 2 survivorship curve organisms would be like a bird. They have a moderate number of babies at once, a moderate level of parental care, and pretty much have constant loss. In other words, you're just as likely to die as an infant or a teenager or an adult or an elderly bird at any one of these stages. You're not more likely to die at any one age. So you get a straight line. It's a constant loss. That's a type 2 survivorship curve. And something else like this fish here, maybe this would be a salmon, for example. If they have lots of babies and most of those babies die early on, but then after that you kind of have steady loss and they can live to be long-lived, that is called a type 3 survivorship curve. So, you know, individual species are kind of sometimes hard to categorize, but in general you could categorize them as an R strategist or a K strategist and a type 1, type 2, or type 3 survivorship curve. Okay, this ends our first part of ecology, which is population ecology, and next we're going to go on to the field called community ecology, which is one of my absolute favorites. See you there.